Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Insight interview series. Today, we're going to have a very relevant topic being discussed around the Department of Defense's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And it's my pleasure to introduce two of our panelists, Michael Corcione, who is the lead partner at a new firm that he's just joined called HKA, and he's running their cybersecurity and privacy practice. However, he has over 30 years of professional experience in advisory services, and he advises firms and boards on cybersecurity and privacy strategy, and he leads cyber and information security engagement teams. He also provides advisement on regulatory enforcement matters related to cyber and information security and their appropriate remediation. Previously, he has led client engagements performing cybersecurity business and IT risk assessments, evaluating cyber threat identification, incident response readiness, and testing, as well as regulatory compliance, third-party due diligence, and strategy. He's worked with clients in all different verticals, including government contracting, financial services, asset management, which includes PE, hedge funds, venture capital, real estate, construction, and insurance. And he is a graduate of PACE's Lubin School of Business Management with a degree in the management of information systems. And with him today is Christopher Bender. Chris is the president at North Cross Group. He's a systems and security integration professional with over 30 years of experience in both the public and the private sector. And he has worked with national and international clients in a number of different disciplines, including federal defense, financial services, healthcare, pharmaceutical, energy, aerospace, and the transportation sectors. And his primary focus is to help clients address major challenges and opportunities with a broad, inclusive approach that looks at technologies, systems integration, cybersecurity, risk management, and compliance. He's a CISSP, and he has his master's degree from my husband's alma mater, which is George Washington University. So Michael and Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ariel. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. So let's kick it off with our first question. Some people haven't heard of CMMC. So what is CMMC?
Sure. Well, I'll kick it off, and I want to thank everybody for joining today. Like Ariel said, CMMC is definitely a pretty relevant topic these days. My firm, HKA, has been working with government contractors for 40 plus years, and so seeing a big demand in this area. But essentially, it was put out by the Department of Defense, established beginning of this year. Chatter started about a year or so ago to really help secure the defense industrial base and the information that's being compromised, almost $600 billion a year annually in intellectual property, data theft, other high value targets that are being compromised through the healthcare, defense, financial services sector, and is really an evolution of the existing standards under the FARs, but taking some of the requirements a little bit further to self-attestation that firms have to do and putting in procedures, authorities, and appropriate personnel to do reviews of and validation of the cybersecurity control framework that's in place. Chris, anything you want to add on top?
The only thing that I'd add to that is the one thing to keep in mind with CMMC, it is a maturity model. And those of you who are familiar with maturity models, maybe some of you have worked in the technology side, you've worked with the capability maturity model integration that the Software Engineering Institute put together. Those same folks were involved in putting together CMMC. So if you're familiar with that, you'll see some similarities there. And for those of you who worked in the construct of maturity models, you also know that they have a fair amount of overhead. And there's things that you need to do for the model in addition to the things that you need to do. All the core cyber things under CMMC are things that have been around for a long time. They're things out of the existing FARs and DFARs. They've pulled some things and moved some things around, but for those of you who've worked under NIST constructs, all those things will be very familiar. It's just now it's in a maturity model, and thus it has the sequencing and it has the threshold items that you have within a maturity model. So that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind here is looking at, there's a lot of cyber components under CMMC that you'll need to be aware of and consider, but also consider that you are working through a model. And so being very familiar with the model is very helpful in making sure that you pick the best path forward through it.
Yeah, and over the past year, it's kind of evolved to what the rollout would look like. And so, depending on what type of contract you're looking to participate in, the CMC level 1 through 5 requirements will be required. Is Katie Arrington, who's the CISO of the office, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, just said a few days ago, they're moving forward. They're continuing to push the CMC rollout, but it's through 2025. There's currently also going into effect December 1 an interim rule that is looking to raise the level of requirement that firms are submitting to the DoD through a supplier performance risk system online December 1, that you'll have to upload a NIST 171 maturity assessment, self-assessment, which then can lead to a medium or higher level assessment that would require some attestation from the DoD. So this has been in flux. If you are definitely a contractor working in this Department of Defense space, you should be watching the news. But like Chris said, a lot of the basic foundation principles are, core to your cybersecurity program that you're doing today. More of the DoD getting involved and having a little deeper look and attestation on what you're doing.
Great. I'm just going to remind folks in the audience that when you have a question, please put it in the chat, because at the end of our session, we'll be taking your questions and giving them to Chris and to Mike so they can answer them. So thinking about it from a scoping perspective, who is in scope for this?
Chris, I'll let you start on this one.
So anyone who's doing work with the DoD. So if you are a prime contractor, a subcontractor, anything that you are doing, at least based on the interim rule that came out by 2025, you're going to have to make sure that you're all set up there. If you're dealing with contracts that are put out, or renewals that come out that are classified as having a CMMC level requirement, you're going to have to do that then. So the basic notion is, wherever you are down the supply chain, if you are working with someone who's doing work and the end customer is the Department of Defense, this is something you need to be looking at. And it's one of the things, as we've talked to a number of folks within the defense industrial base, a lot of firms have asked us that question. They say, hey, we've got 12 people. We do this, this, and that, and there's no one who could possibly care about that. And that's they want to see, they're looking at the cost and the time to make this happen. The thing is, though, is that the way that the DoD is looking at it, it is a all or nothing type of thing. If you don't comply with the level you need to have, you just can't be listed on the contract, no matter what type of thing that you're doing. And now there may be a little bit of runway now based on the interim rule before that all happens, but it's something that people need to think about and plan on. And the one thing we tell some of those firms, like that 12-person shop, that you are going to grow, you want to expand, you want to do more things. The stuff that CMMC is talking about is also good business. So it is things that you want to look at, how you can make this a part of your business plan going forward and build those things in. And sometimes it's a little easier said than done, but it is possible to do a lot of the things in there without a lot of investment, as long as you're thinking about it strategically as well.
Yeah, and on that point, Chris, to who it applies to, so the contractors, the subcontractors, and a lot of the smaller shops out there. And what the Department of Defense has been messaging out pretty consistently has been that they're not only looking at improving the maturity of these firms, but they're looking at the threat landscape. And the two biggest concerns in a keynote speech that Chris Krebs gave yesterday on a conference that I was on before he got his news from the president, was that they are looking at two areas, being the supply chain, like Chris mentioned, and then also third-party risk. Even construction companies that are getting involved in some of the buildings, some of that material that somebody else mentioned earlier that gets compromised from critical infrastructure, buildings, departments. But even on the smaller firms, some of the attacks they're seeing are getting in and tampering with specifications on parts and materials. And then basically altering those, it gets through the supply chain, it gets to a point where it fails and basically slows things up. So there's many areas that they see the smaller firms being more likely targets, and that's why this is going to be pretty broad based on who it applies to.
Mm-hmm. So there's 24 categories and 83 subcategories of what is called CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. And are you saying that if we look at these different subcategories, that all of these are going to fall under CMMC, or is it just going to be supply chain types of vendors? What does that look like?
Chris, you want to take that one?
Yeah, it should apply to everything. It seems to be the path that they are going down. The things that, and I think the big deal with CMMC is that for those entities that are in the non-supply chain type of things and different types of services, for the most part, they're covered under different types of frameworks that are already looking at these types of things, and they actually have to commit to things much higher. So to that point, I don't think it's going to be much of a concern or much of an issue at play there. So for instance, we're a DoD supplier as well, and we do work for the Department of Defense through a couple of different agencies. The things that are being talked about in CMMC are things that we've had to solve and implement and institutionalize many, many, many years ago. And so it's just adding another thing to the list that you kind of check off and you get those certifications. So I think where the impact is going to be is for those folks who somewhat, and I use this term, but it might be a little unfair, but some have been under the radar of people really looking and checking. They might have checked a few boxes and said, no one's ever going to pay attention. And I think part of what DoD is doing, and this is my personal opinion, but I think what they want to do is say that no one falls under the radar with this thing because it's that weakest link in the chain. And so I think the focus is going to be on that supply chain piece and not really on the other areas. Certainly if those other areas have issues and problems, they need to address those, but there's also a number of other constructs that are somewhat keeping them to the straight and narrow path there.
Great. So what's the relationship to DFARS? Is it going to replace DFARS? Is it complementing DFARS? What does that look like?
So it's not replacing the DFARS. The DFARS have been amended actually to talk to CMMC, and CMMC covers things that are in the basic FARS and then also in the DFARS pieces. And they brought in a few other little component pieces within the model itself and that construct to put it in there. So nothing that is in the DFARS is going away. Nothing in the FARS is going away. This is just really a model that helps DoD know that someone is doing and how well they're doing the things that are in the DFARS and the FARS. So anyone who's already built their compliance program around the DFARS and FARS requirements that apply to them, they're in good shape and they've been doing most of the things that they need here. The only real thing is taking what they have and figuring out how it works within the context of the model and being able to demonstrate the different maturity levels when they go through the certification process.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so this new interim rule that they just put in place in September, basically saying that there's a 3 years worth of implementation that they've been doing. What does that exactly mean? What's the relationship with the interim rule that was released?
Well, I'm not sure what they're claiming their 3 years of implementation thus far really is. There's been one of the things that we've heard a lot from folks is that there's still people that haven't heard the first word of this. And as they're hearing it through media and such, are like, oh, what's this? And these are defense contractors and at various levels too. And there seems to have been a wide range of communication through contract officers and such. Obviously, there's been the public facing stuff, but not every company pays as much attention to that as others do. So I don't know exactly what all has happened in that space. However, with the interim rule going forward, it basically sets up a 5-year framework that's going to happen. And what you have is you have a kind of, as they put out renewals and new contracts, they being Department of Defense, if there are things that need to be given a maturity level based on the nature of that, it has to be approved by the Department of Defense, and they'll put that on there and it applies. What they're also saying is that by October 2025, everyone who's doing work with DoD, so a blanket statement that every new contract, every renewal is going to have some maturity level requirement in it. And to that point, as Mike mentioned earlier, there's those 5 levels. And so if you have a requirement that has level 2, or if you have a level 4 or 1 or whatever it may be, you're going to have to be at that level. You're going to have to maintain it through that contract period. And you have to get recertified at least every 3 years. And so what's going to happen is based on the nature, and they didn't really provide much of a criteria for how they'll apply those maturity levels between now and 2025, but what you're going to have is a rolling type of impact. And so I think each business is going to have to look at that and say, where do we think we might stand with this? And I think the more prudent measure would be is every business who's not pretty self-assured that they're going to be able to get certified at a certain maturity level needs to start now, if they haven't already, figuring out how they can get themselves properly prepared.
Okay. So what do you see as the big differences between what they're doing today and what they're doing in the future? Like, is it going to be more audit focused, where it's not just trust, but it's trust and verify? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, absolutely, Ariel. It's definitely going to the trust and verify model. And one thing that was also set up as part of CMMC and working with the DoD is a non-for-profit accreditation body that helps administer the CMMC. And what they are also doing is they are establishing third-party assessors that will go out and do the assessments of the companies. And so what's really firm should be doing and working towards that is doing readiness reviews, some type of pre-assessment work. Like Chris said, if they're already under the DFARS clauses 800, 171, they should be in pretty good shape. But these assessors, depending on the level of maturity that you're looking to strive, basically above level 1, so 2, 3, 4, and 5, they'll come out, they'll be certified by the accreditation body, and they'll perform the assessment, which will be looking for validation, reviewing some scanning reports, showing your compliance program. So it's really important that working towards CMMC certification, you're doing a good job of making sure your documentation is tight, your processes are easily displayed to an assessor that's going to come in and make those reviews. And essentially, there can't be any POAMs in your security plan. Everything has to be fully implemented to get the approval.
And what is the name of that accreditation body?
It's
Do we
the
know?
Department of Defense accreditation body, I believe it is. Correct, Chris?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, and there's the CMMC Accreditation Board, which is a new entity. It's a nonprofit entity that has been stood up. It has a memorandum of, I believe, agreement in place with the Department of Defense in order to go through a process of certifying organizations to be organizations that help groups get ready for certification and also do the certification. So they would be creating a group of private sector entities that could do that auditing as well. I think DoD has also said that given the size of the defense industrial base, over 220,000, I believe is the number they've been throwing around, the existing accreditation functions that they have within DoD just don't have the current capacity. And so I think they're using the model of going out to industry and using a quality control model in order to get folks to help run those through.
Yeah, Joe Vigorito has a really good comment here because it fits in with what we're talking about now. I'm going to read it now. So he's saying, I have a member of my team in the process of becoming a certified assessor for the CMMC program. As I'm reviewing the materials published by the CMMC Accreditation Board on its website, it appears that there is a requirement regarding the corporation relationship with the CMMC Advisory Board. My review of the materials indicates that organizations have the option to become a CMMC third-party assessor organization, which is abbreviated C3PAO. It sounds like something from Star Wars, or a registered service organization, which is an RPO, not recovery point objective. It also leads me to believe that the CAs have to be affiliated with the C3PAO, not just to perform assessments, but also to provide certified consulting. Can you comment on the requirements for the C3PAO vis-a-vis their staff members seeking the certified assessor status? Great question, Joe. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I would defer speaking to the CMMC-AB directly with their requirements as opposed to what we can do. I certainly offer my understanding of it. And just for the record, we are an RPO under the CMMC-AB. So the role that we're playing with that is, and to kind of just break down the question, is the RPOs are entities that are supposed to be helping folks prepare, get ready, and go through the process that they need to do in order to be ready to be certified. The third-party assessor organization is the one who's doing the assessments, and thus they should not be doing the prep work. And that's kind of the line of demarcation between those, which is typical in most audit assessment and support role type of things. The independence of a CA, my understanding is that a CA can be an independent entity if it's an individual. But I am not an expert on the AB's rules and that kind of stuff, and they certainly have folks in place that can answer those questions. So for the specifics of that, and if you're getting someone on your team set up up to do that stuff, I would certainly make sure that you reach out to them and talk through that process and just make sure you set yourself up properly. And if part of the question there was if you have someone on your team, if you were trying to get certified and yourself and you have someone on your team who becomes a CA, can they do it? My understanding is no, they can't. You'd have to use someone from another party, but you can provide that CA services to other entities. So it depends on what your end goal is.
Got it.
Great, thanks. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for that, Chris. So some of the other things that we wanted to look at were, so we talked a little bit about the steps we can take to prepare. One of the questions we also have is related to one of those preparation steps. So Francois wants to know, can you help us understand how closely the CMC overlaps with the other standards like ISO and the SSSAE 16 or GDPR or any of the other ones that are out there?
Sure, I'll start off and then hand over to Chris. I mean, I'd say a lot of them are very comparable because it's about data protection, data security, whereas Chris mentioned on the CMMC is it's a maturity model. So, the standards to say that you have achieved them in some type of ad hoc or informal fashion, being more towards a level 1, but the formality of your policies and procedures and those processes we mentioned before to show that they're going through the 3 lines of defense, that you're doing appropriate risk assessments to identify the types of controls that you need to put in place, articulating and codifying in policies and procedures, and then having the process to review and test against those. All very similar to what you're going to see in other frameworks. Not too much of a lift. What we're seeing, some organizations that we're working with today may have a mission to strive towards CMMC compliance or NIST 171, and developing a framework that will allow you to easily adopt additional standards and frameworks makes it a pretty small lift. So the core of all of these are very, very similar. It's some of the specifics that are going to be around the controls and then the levels of maturity that's required specifically in CMMC. Chris, anything you want to add specifically other than the maturity aspect of these frameworks?
Yeah, just so if the question is coming from the standpoint of if you're looking or you have aligned with ISO 27000 or you've gone through your SSAE 16s or the SAS 70, the current version of that stuff, and done your control work and that kind of stuff, you're in real good shape for what you're going to need to do for CMMC. The thing is, if you haven't done it and you're looking to figure out what you should try to align to, that's great, but be careful of how broadly you're looking at that. The CMMC does not go as far as 27,000. It does not go as far as and I say that from a breadth standpoint. In certain areas on details, it goes a little bit further in certain areas. So you want to be strategic with where you're spending your time and energy. So make sure you're doing the things that you need to do in order to get certified at your target maturity level. Certainly, if you have those pieces in there, you're going to be in really good shape. GDPR in particular is focused more on the privacy pieces. The basis of it, though, you need the same type of controls that you need for data security in order to add in those privacy pieces. So same type of thing, though, there. So again, in order to do GDPR, and again, just leaving from the standpoint, it depends on what your business is. If your business is all DoD and you're focused in the US, GDPR may not be something that's a high priority. Things like CCPA might be a little bit more, and there is some overlap between those. So the one thing to do is if there's a lot, and I apologize for folks who might not be familiar with all the acronyms we're throwing around here, but these are different types of frameworks and compliance frameworks and requirements and such. And for any organization, it can sometimes be a little confusing what these all are. Some of them are talking about very similar things, but these different language. So it is useful to get someone to help you interpret and figure out which way you go, because you can spend a lot of time and energy on something that may not get you very far as where you really need to be. So you want to make sure that you have either some guidance or help, or spend a bit of time doing some research to make sure that you are taking the right steps in the right direction and you're spending your time and energy wisely.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, the big difference with the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which primarily applies to European Union private data, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, those also have the data subject rights and the consumer subject rights, which wouldn't be anything applicable to CMMC. So that's being able to go in and exercise right of erasure, right of validation, right of transparency and accuracy. So a little bit different on the privacy side, and definitely an outlier versus what's in the CMMC framework.
It
And what
actually,
did-
just one quick follow-up. I'm sorry, Ariel.
No, go ahead.
Just one small thing there, though. Mike mentions with things like GDPR, when you're looking at the consumer type of protection functions and the level of control of the data that you have, there's some interesting components there because with CMMC, you are allowed to segment and you are allowed to say that certain components comply, and that's what you can draw a boundary around the things for which you're getting certified. So if you're in a larger organization that's fairly complex, and again, getting back to the strategic part, excuse me, looking at where you draw some of those lines. And if you already have those capabilities and that granular level of managing your data, like you'd have to if you're already doing things for GDPR or CCPA, you can look at how you might do that from a CMMC standpoint too. And you might find that you have a lot or almost everything you need in place. It's really drawing the boundaries the right way and having the right documentation in order to take you through the maturity model piece. Sorry, Ariel.
No, not at all. I think it's really good what you're saying. So tying that into what we're doing at PACE, okay, when we are going through the security assessment piece of the class, because you're looking at it from a digital asset perspective, you're actually able to map all the different types of control tests across all of the frameworks. And this will be no different for CMMC. We have it for GDPR, we have it for ISO, we have it for PCI, we have it for all of them. So one of the things students are learning is what exactly are they asking you for? What is the context of what they're asking you for? And a lot of times, as Michael indicated earlier, GDPR is for EU citizen privacy data. So if you're processing that, you're in scope for the GDPR. And most organizations are going to be in scope for more than one type of compliance model. It could be CMMC, it could be GDPR, it could be New York State Part 500. And the idea is to understand that you're not really going to be testing these things 3 different times. You're going to be testing them once because you need to take the lowest lying commonality and use the most stringent aspect of the compliance model and just roll it across your organization. Do not bifurcate out your compliance models. But to Chris's point, understand where you are in scope and where you are not in scope. Because if you're not in scope for CMMC on this particular system, then guess what? Don't test for it. But if you are in scope for it, make sure that that specific testing requirement is across all of your different compliance models, whichever frameworks we're using, whether they be prescriptive like PCI DSS or non-prescriptive like the Insurance Data Security Act. So you're going to see prescriptive where New York State Department of Financial Services is saying it has to be in this cybersecurity framework. GDPR is not prescriptive. It's not telling you what to do, but there is a lot of additional requirements around the data subject rights, which may or may not play into CCMC, around the right of rectification, the right to deletion. Those are Articles 12 through 21, the data subject assets rights. So you might want to look at them and see if there's applicability. But I would definitely encourage folks who want to understand this better to take the class, because this is something that's a big focus of the class. Okay. So how long does it take to get certified?
I guess, if you feel you're ready to get certified, and as Chris said, the the advisory board would probably be able to give more updated guidance depending on how they're rolling out their C3 PAOs. But the lists and what they put out there is about 60 days. And if you to schedule it and then get an assessor to come out, I don't know how many they're ramping up. I think it's going to be a volume perspective. 15 contracts are going to come under the purview in 2021, which they estimate is about 1,500 companies that would need to get assessed next year. So I think it's going to be a volume resources demand. If you do have failures, they will give you the opportunity to have them come back within 90 days to rectify those and remediate. But the whole point is you want to make sure that you're ready when that assessor comes in so that you don't have to reschedule or go through that process again.
Right. And then I believe I heard that there is about somewhere around 300,000 different contractors who sort of fall under this. Is that number right? Or am I adding on an extra zero?
No, well, that's the number that has been floated out there, 300 to 400,000, and then you can add the zero by throwing subcontractors in there as well, right? So
Right,
a
right.
significant footprint. Chris, you hear about the same estimates? I know you
Yeah,
work with quite a few.
there are quite a few folks out there, so it is a large number.
And though what is looking at is other agencies like DHS and the federal divisions of the government are looking at this model and possibly adopting them. DHS has their own 4300A that's very similar to the CMMC, but doesn't have the validation and the maturity aspect that CMMC does. So they're watching this, and definitely the thought and trend is that it will move into other agencies and expand even further.
So there's a really great follow-up question to this from Keith Strasberg. The CMMC says that subcontractors, supply chain members will also need CMMC certification. When would a subcontractor require CMMC certification, and would it have to be at the same level as the company itself?
It's going to be based on the contract. So if there's a contract, a renewal or a new one, it's going to specify the level, which will cascade to everyone in it. They have not said any intent at the moment to bifurcate that or to have any tiering. That may change. So for folks working in the DoD space, you know that some of these contracts are extremely large, that do a lot of different things. So they may look at some of that, but that's just a guess. It's basing that on what's happened in the past. Also looking at what happened with CMM and CMMI and the federal space in general from a software engineering standpoint over the years. That evolved a little bit. But as it stands right now, regardless of where you are down that chain, you need to look at, for the work that you're doing in the sense of the contracts that you're actually supporting, where are those, and try to make your guess as to the likelihood of the level that you need to be at, or shoot to go as high as you possibly can right now and go from there.
Right. So it would be a good idea for those subcontractors to start working with their primes, right? To understand, like,
Absolutely.
where do they think they have to fall? And then they can get a better understanding of where they're going to be, right?
Yeah, I know
there's
some primes have been
craziness.
pretty proactive thus far with putting out messaging, but it varies significantly. And so
Right.
if you are part of under a prime, I would strongly suggest reaching out to them and starting to have that dialogue, so at least you can all be on the same page. And to that point, you don't get caught in a situation where they're planning on one thing and you might be looking at something very different.
Absolutely.
Great. So we understand that it's going to have a framework. We understand that it's going to follow your typical assessment process, and that if we have ISO under our belt or PCI or whatever, that we're going to be in fairly good shape. What exceptions might we see around this, if any, that are going to be weighted higher in terms of the actual controls themselves? Like, are they looking more at access controls versus encryption versus audit management? Like, is there anything specific that they see as being more of a pain point than we typically look at when we look across an entire framework? Most of the time they're weighted pretty similar. Folks aren't even weighting them. They're just saying, okay, yes, I've got it. Yes, I've got it, which we all know where that leads. Any ideas on that?
Well, as far as the weighting goes, there's certainly an ordering that's through the different maturity levels, and that's something you need to be aware of. And it crosses the domains. So you have elements of one domain that span multiple maturity levels, and they're picking and choosing the controls underneath it. I haven't done a real line by line, but just a kind of a cursory comparison between that and the prioritization that you have in the NIST 853. The current version is Rev 5. They're pretty similar. So if you've been working under those constructs, which is consistent with most of the other frameworks, so like the basics of, if you don't have any access control components in your organization, you should probably deal with that first before you deal with your incident response pieces. And not to say that one is more important or less important, it's a sequencing of what you need first, and as you build things up. So certainly you want to be very aware of those things. And I think my guess is they like what's in the maturity model, so you're going to kind of follow that and go forward from there. don't see there being too much more creativity in that area. I also think that just generally, if you look at what's in there, it's pretty consistent with just good cyber hygiene type practices that are pretty standard. So I wouldn't expect too much variance in there. But Mike, anything that
Okay.
you wanted?
No, I would just say in the, the DoD 800-171 assessment methodology is part of the interim rule. Looking through that does have some weighting, but very similar, like Chris mentioned, access rights where it goes across multiple domains and will take off those points in certain areas. So it does have an element of weightings on that. The maximum score is 110 for the 110 controls that are in there. But technically, because it does cross, you could work your way into a negative score if you had zero implementation.
Mhm. It would be interesting to get a link to how they've parsed that out for us to share with folks if people are interested in that. I'd be interested in seeing it. I'd like to understand it a little bit better. So we talked about failing an assessment, right? So you go through the process and all of a sudden you see that you're not at the right levels. They're going to give you some type of formal notice and you have 90 days to cure it. Is that what you said?
It was during the initial assessment. That's what I've seen on the AB's website.
Okay. Okay. Sounds reasonable. And what are we looking at from a cost perspective relatively? So there's the whole planning piece, right? This is going to be interesting. So there's a whole planning piece, and then there's doing the assessment, and then there's getting the audit, and then there's doing the rectification within the 90 days. So you're looking at, at least a 6-month investment on most people's parts, I'd say. Would that be right?
I think it depends completely on the organization, but like you categorize, there's a lot of different areas. A lot of it is human resources. I think the longer you take to get started, the more it'll cost you because you're going to have to accelerate in those efforts. From a technology perspective, the requirements aren't as prescriptive as to the exact controls that have to be put in place. So a lot of them you can use mitigating controls or other type of compensating controls to meet the same objective. From a cost perspective, it's on your resources that you have internally and how mature you are. We have firms that have a pretty light touch. They're a smaller organization. They may want to go out and just secure from an MSP a fully baked laptop that has all the compliance built into the machine that they're working on. We have other organizations that may be pretty large and global and have decided they want to ring fence or create a greenfield environment that they can quickly ramp up, get the policies and procedures in place, because that's what's going to be the biggest lift in any organization. If you have to go in and update your policies and procedures, put in new additional controls, getting those rolled out, getting the training to the user community, that's where you're going to have your biggest lift. So in those areas, some firms we've seen have chosen to create a greenfield environment. Let's get our contract work there. Let's know we have this pristine area that we can move forward, and then make those decisions and determinations across the larger organization as other groups may get involved. Chris, I know we've seen a wide range on pricing and what firms' costs can be. I don't know if you want to add anything on top. My answer was definitely not pinpointed.
The only thing I would add to that is, and Mike's absolutely right, it's going to vary a lot. The one thing that I would recommend folks starting on this journey is to figure out, look at what makes sense to do some of these things. You don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money for a lot of these component pieces to get some of these practices in place, even to put together policies, procedures, some of the planning pieces. They sound a little worse than they have to be when you read the documentation. So again, taking some time to really think through it, figure out what a strategy is and how to leverage some of those things can really help you manage your costs at getting ready. And certainly if you're doing some of these things already, taking a moment to take a look at what you already have and say, are we pretty much doing something that's being called for? We don't call it that. We don't break it up in the same ways. That might just be more an administrative thing to figure out how you get it to fit the mold. So I do think it's worth looking at these things strategically and figure out what the exact pathway for you is. And that's going to drive how you figure out the cost piece of it.
And I think one thing I'd add in too on the cost is, we did mention before, an assessment's good for 3 years. So you'd have to get reassessed. So it's not a one and done. So you do need to maintain the program, keep these controls up to the levels that they need to have for an efficiency and effective perspective, and having some type of tooling in place to manage your compliance. We talked before about the requirement in maturity reviews to display compliance and show that testing evidence. And so having something in place that can manage that through in perpetuity of your program is very helpful, as you well know, Ariel, because you don't want to get caught where you got things stood up, you passed your assessment, and then they fall, by the wayside, and you need to ramp back up again and extend costs all over again.
And my best guess on this, for anybody who cares what I think about this, is probably between $40,000 and $60,000, just based upon the amount of work that you may have to do and all the checking that you're going to have to do. Even if you do have the policies and procedures in place, you're going to have to go back and look at them. You have to make sure they're adequate. Do they have the right components? Are they effective? Right. One of the things we're also teaching in the course, and those people who take our course do get access to templates of policies and procedures for all the different cybersecurity assessment components that you have. So if that's interesting to anyone, let me know. We have another question that's really great from Joe. He received a question from a client about, what if I'm CMMC certified and I have a significant data breach? Do I lose my certification? And what are your insights? Can DoD order a reassessment at that point?
I don't know exactly. I think you'd have to consult the AB specifically, but I'll opine on this just from a view of other regulators and what we've seen, and then I'll pass over to Chris. I think it depends on the state of your program at the time of the breach, right? If things have become, inefficient, if you've had negligence in maintaining controls and keeping your program up to it, that could definitely have a negative impact, I would think, going forward. But if it looks like you've done everything you could, breaches are expected. And then it comes down to, right, how did you respond? How well did you recover? Chris, do you have any insights on specifically if they've talked about rescinding a certification?
I haven't heard anything specifically there, but in the same vein to the models that are out there, there are a lot of very robust, great security programs that have been breached. I would be surprised if there be some type of automatic triggering if you have a breach that you would lose your certification. Certainly, if the breach unearths something where there is negligence and things that have been done fraudulently or anything like that with anything that comes in, I think that's a different case. But I don't think that suffering some type of data breach would necessarily have that happen. There certainly will probably be some sort of chain of events, and certainly doing things like a recheck or recertification things is a typical set of actions there. But I think I don't think this is designed and set up to be overtly more punitive, in the sense that if something happens to you, they're going to also slap you with some other actions. So I think it's going to really depend on the exact circumstances there. And it's also just the acceptance of the fact that what we're doing is we're working on the likelihood of these things happening, and there's still a chance that you can get hit. And part of it is probably going to be how you respond and recover to it. That's going to also drive what happens.
Yeah, my thoughts on that are that the way that Health and Human Services works with HIPAA is the fining component is based upon willful neglect versus were you aware or completely unaware, and then that goes to your level of hygiene, right? So I would think that they'd probably do something similar, but I think the guys are right that, data breaches are not an if, it's a when. And the question is more about, were you really completely sloppy? Did you just get your certification and just say, okay, we don't have to do anything anymore? Or did you keep the program up, and were you on top of everything? And as your infrastructure changed, did you align to those changes that were going to impact CMMC or not, right? So I think that would be the way I would look at it.
Yeah, I would just add too, I would think one reason that the DoD may not get prescriptive and make it an automatic dismissal of your certification could be because of the criticality of the vendor and where they are in the supply chain. So you may not want to disqualify somebody where they are in the current process of delivery.
Exactly. It may not make sense, right? So why don't you guys give us some final thoughts, and then we'll go into a few more questions from the folks that are in the chat.
I think I'll just reiterate a lot of what we said before. Definitely, as Chris mentioned, you need to pay attention to what are the requirements for your company. What type of business are you going to be pursuing? If you've done well with your program to date and have maturity built in and the model that you've had implemented all along, you should be in pretty good shape. If not, it's a good time to get started, whether it's the CMMC or other requirements, other regulations. Every business is seeing the bar ramped up. What we've seen specifically too from our side, where we work with a lot of the government contractors, is the due diligence questionnaires that are being put across are getting stronger. They're getting smarter on what they're asking. A lot of cases not asking for the evidence coming across, but that trend's going to continue. So whether it's the DoD checking in or the relationships that you're working with directly, the bar will continue to raise. And so you need to just keep making progress and have a proactive program to strive towards those goals.
Great. And Chris, final thoughts?
Yeah, just a minor thing to add to what Mike said. If you are starting out or one of your clients is starting out with CMMC, and they really are at the starting point, make sure that they take the time to really understand the model and how the model works and look at the sequencing of steps, because those types of organizations are going to have resource constraints, whether on people or on finances to make these things happen. And you really do need to pay attention to how the model is set up, because if you spend too much time and energy in certain threads of things, you may get a lot less far in the model than you really are hoping to. And so you do need to look at that very carefully. And it is kind of an all or nothing type of thing, is if you don't have everything that you need for maturity level 1, you're not getting to level 2. Or if you're in level 2 and you've got a bunch of things in level 4 and 5, if you don't have the stuff to get to 3, you're stuck at level 2. And it's one of those things just to pay attention to. It's a little bit of gaming, and it can make a big difference when you're trying to plan, especially for a smaller entity that is really constrained as to what to do first, second, third.
Yeah, exactly. And then one more thing before we go to the questions is in 2021, this is on our roadmap to be delivered as a course. So this will be a 42-hour course coming up probably in September, October of 2021 to align to the capability model and to train people of how to work through all these different layers of compliance with the CMMC. So stay tuned for that, folks. Okay, we got a question from Mary Kay. Would you expect that the CMMC will replace the SOC reports for third-party vendors and sub-service organizations? Mary Kay, from your lips to God's ears. Fellas, what do you think of that?
I haven't heard anything of it changing the SOC reports on third-party vendors. Those are often performed by accounting firms. So they're doing attestation reports, so a different credential required. Chris, I don't know if you've heard anything making any changes.
Well, I think there's absolutely no chance of that happening. The SOC reports are not going away, and they're from different perspectives and they're used differently.
Okay.
So you're going to continue to have SOC reports, and as Mike said, you have to have that performed by a member of AICPA, so you're certified consultants, and so that's not going to change. What I think you need to think about is how you can internally prepare for both those types of exercises. So what you need to do for your SOC exams, what you need to do for your CMMC exams, and anything else that falls into that. And that's just going to be a way of doing business going forward.
Yeah, unfortunately.
They're not that bad.
I think they're worthless. I'm sorry, I really do. I think they're worthless, and they cost lots of money for people.
They're very expensive, but I meant they're not so bad in trying to get through for an organization. But
we've definitely seen a lot of people take them as more of a check the box exercise, and so I think how that report is handled internally can definitely make a difference.
Exactly. So there's a couple links that David Diaphano has provided for folks in the chat that are very useful. I would suggest that you click on them and save them. I think they look good. Questions from the folks that are on the phone, please put in the chat. I've gone through everybody's questions so far.
Just one quick thing, Ariel, though, on the note of links, and thanks, David, for sharing those. The other thing is make sure you check out the the DoD site as well for their information on CMMC. When you pull up some of those documents and you see that a PDF is over 300 odd pages, you kind of go, "Ooh, what do I really want to do it?" But use the table of contents to work through some of those things. They've actually put a fair amount of decent information in there and some context around what they're talking about with different things. So certainly not exactly your bedtime reading at any point in time, but it is a good reference and you can walk through some of those things. So I would encourage you to take advantage of the stuff that they do have out there. It's certainly free. You don't have to pay anyone for it. And there is some good information in there.
Okay. If you guys have links to that, I'll share them with everybody as well when we
I'll
send
pull it
out the
down.
link to this as well.
Okay.
That would be great. Okay, give it another minute to see if anyone else has a question. I'm surprised Vlad does not have a question. Vlad, you always have a question.
Well, honestly, it's just this part of the world is far away from where I am. Like I'm
That's true.
not related to government. I don't work for the government, never worked with the government. So thank you very much for information. If I ever will, I have a lot of, I really don't have any questions right now, sorry.
All right, great. Okay, I'll give it one more minute to see if there's another question. And if not, then we will wrap it up. As all of you know, this link will be available for you to share with your peers, your colleagues, your organization. You will be getting it in your monthly newsletter, which is published at the beginning of every month. So don't forget to pass along whatever we do to everyone so everyone can get the same knowledge, and let's get all on the same page. Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up then, fellas. Thank you so much to Michael and to Chris for their time today on such a great topic. Really was great. And I'm sure that this is going to be something that's going to be shared across many different organizations.
Thank you very much.
See you on
Bye, guys.
Cyber Insight interview.
Thank you, Michael.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Chris.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Bye.
great day.
Take
Everybody.
care.
Have a
Bye-bye.
great
Bye,
day.
everybody.
Bye.
Take care.